He wanted to adopt the most beautiful cat, but ended up choosing the saddest one, and that saved his life. Thaddeus Avner stared at his reflection in the kitchen window as he made his morning coffee. At 62, the lines on his face had deepened, not just from age, but from a particular kind of solitude that had settled into his bones. Outside, the small town of Crestville, Ohio, was stirring to life. Children waited for school buses at the corner, and Mrs. Patterson from 2 doors down walked her ancient beagle along the sidewalk. Life went on for everyone else in predictable rhythms, but inside 247 Maple Avenue, time had frozen 3 years ago. The morning light slipped through half-drawn curtains, illuminating a living room that seemed preserved rather than lived in. Thaddeus moved carefully around the kitchen, his slippers whispering against the linoleum floor. He reached for a mug, always the same blue ceramic one with a chip on the handle, and left Doreen's favorite yellow cup untouched on the shelf, where it had been since that final morning. His routine never varied. Coffee at 6, black with 1 sugar. The Crestville Gazette at 7, though he rarely absorbed more than the headlines. Lunch was whatever could be heated in 4 minutes in the microwave, usually a frozen meal that tasted of cardboard and salt. Dinner was eaten from a tray in front of the television, which droned on about world events that seemed to happen in some parallel universe, far removed from the stillness of his home. Every night before bed, he would check the locks twice, straighten Doreen's reading glasses on the side table where she'd left them, and pause at the door of what had been their bedroom. He slept in the guest room now. Their room remained exactly as it had been on that February morning, when Doreen had kissed him goodbye, promised to pick up his prescription on her way home from her sister's, and never returned. A patch of black ice on Route 33 had rewritten everything. 3 years, he murmured to the empty kitchen. His voice sounded strange in the silence, like it belonged to someone else. The telephone rang, startling him. He let it ring 4 times before answering, knowing exactly who it would be. "Uncle Thad, it's Vianne." His niece called every Tuesday and Friday like clockwork. She was Doreen's sister's daughter, the only family he had left since his brother moved to Arizona and gradually stopped calling. "Good morning, Vianne," he said, his voice warming slightly. "How are you doing today? Did you eat breakfast?" The questions were always the same, her concern both touching and mildly irritating. At 62, being asked if he'd eaten breakfast made him feel like he was either 5 or 95. "I'm having coffee," he replied, "and I'll have toast in a bit." "Good." There was a pause, and he could hear her shuffling papers. Vianne was always busy, always moving. At 35, she ran the town library and served on 3 community boards. "Listen, Uncle Thad, I've been thinking." "A dangerous pastime," he said, attempting humor. She laughed softly. "I have something to suggest, and before you say no, just hear me out." Thaddeus sighed. "Go ahead. I think you should get a pet." The suggestion hung in the air between them. A pet. The idea seemed absurd, like suggesting he take up skydiving or learn Mandarin. "I don't need a pet, Vianne." "Need? Maybe not, but want? It might surprise you." Her voice softened. "That house is too quiet, Uncle Thad. And you're too alone." "I'm used to the quiet," he said, though even to his own ears the words sounded hollow. "There's a difference between peaceful quiet and empty quiet. You know that." She paused. "Look, my friend Margot volunteers at Willow Haven Rescue Center. It's a nice place, not far from you. They have cats." "Cats?" Thaddeus interjected. "Yes, cats. Low maintenance, independent, but still company. They don't need walking like dogs. Just food, water, a clean litter box, and maybe a little attention when they want it." She took a breath. "Would you at least go look? For me? For Aunt Doreen?" The mention of his wife's name was deliberate, and they both knew it. Doreen had always wanted a cat, but Thaddeus had been allergic in his younger years. The allergies had faded with age, a fact Doreen had happily discovered when they'd cat-sat for a neighbor 5 years ago. But life had been busy then, with Doreen's volunteer work and Thaddeus still working at the hardware store. They'd talked about getting a cat someday. Someday never came. "I'll think about it," he said finally. "That's all I ask," Vianne replied, relief evident in her voice. "Willow Haven is open Tuesday through Saturday, 10 to 4. Just go in, look around. Choose one cat, one, and see what happens." After they hung up, Thaddeus stood in the middle of his kitchen, listening to the familiar sounds of his empty house, the refrigerator's gentle hum, the ticking of the wall clock that had been a wedding present 40 years ago, the occasional creak of the floorboards settling. He glanced at Doreen's coat, still hanging by the door. Her gardening gloves were on the side table, curved as if her hands might slip into them at any moment. Sometimes in the quiet mornings, he imagined he could hear her humming in the garden, the way she used to while tending her roses. "A cat," he said aloud, testing the word in the empty room. That evening, as he watched the news without really seeing it, his eyes kept drifting to the empty space beside him on the sofa. The cushion was still plump, unused since Doreen's passing. He'd accidentally sat in her spot once, about a month after the funeral, and had been so overwhelmed with guilt that he'd stood up immediately and hadn't tried again. But a cat might sit there. A cat wouldn't care about invisible boundaries and preserved memories. A cat would make its own rules. The thought was both unsettling and, strangely, a little intriguing. As he prepared for bed that night, checking the locks, straightening Doreen's glasses, he paused at their bedroom door as usual. But this time, instead of simply walking past, he rested his hand on the doorknob. "What do you think, Doreen?" he whispered to the closed door. "A cat?" The house answered with silence, but for a moment he thought he felt a warmth against his palm, like the faintest pressure of another hand over his. In the dim hallway, Thaddeus made a decision that would, though he couldn't know it then, change everything. Saturday morning dawned bright and cold, the kind of autumn day that painted Crestville in shades of gold and amber. Thaddeus stood before his closet, considering what one wore to visit an animal shelter. It seemed important, somehow, to make a good impression. He finally settled on a clean pair of khakis and a navy cardigan Doreen had given him for Christmas 4 years ago. He hadn't told Vianne he was going. Something about this felt private, a decision he needed to make alone. As he backed his aging Buick out of the garage, he still wasn't entirely convinced he'd go through with it. Maybe he'd just drive by the shelter. Maybe he'd just look. No commitments. Willow Haven Rescue Center sat on the outskirts of town, a converted farmhouse with a large sign featuring painted silhouettes of dogs and cats. The parking lot had only a few cars, and Thaddeus sat in his for several minutes, hands still on the steering wheel, engine off. "This is ridiculous," he muttered to himself. "I'm just looking." The reception area was bright and cheerful, with colorful posters of happy pets and their new families. A young woman with a pink streak in her dark hair smiled at him from behind the desk. "Good morning. Welcome to Willow Haven. I'm Skylar. Are you looking to adopt today?" "I'm just looking," Thaddeus said quickly. "My niece suggested she thought perhaps—" "A cat," Skylar supplied helpfully, noticing his glance toward the door marked "cat room." "Yes, though I'm not certain it's a good idea." "Well, there's no harm in meeting some of our residents," she said, coming around the desk. "Our cat room is pretty full right now. Spring and summer are kitten season, so we get a lot of adult cats surrendered when people decide to get kittens instead." The thought made Thaddeus frown. "People give up their older cats for kittens." Skylar nodded sadly. "More often than you'd think, but that means we have lots of wonderful adult cats who are already trained and have developed personalities. You can really see who they are." She led him to the cat room, a spacious area with large windows and climbing structures. The warm air carried the scent of clean litter and cat food. Immediately, Thaddeus noticed the symphony of activity. At least 20 cats of various colors and sizes occupied the room, some lounging on platforms attached to the walls, others playing with toys or each other. "Feel free to walk around," Skylar said. "All our cats are friendly, though some are shyer than others. If you'd like to interact with any of them more closely, just let me know." Thaddeus nodded, suddenly feeling overwhelmed. How did one choose a single cat from so many? He'd never had a pet before, not even as a child. His father had been practical to a fault. Animals were for farms, not houses. He made his way slowly around the room, observing. A sleek orange tabby batted playfully at a feather toy, performing impressive acrobatics that made Skylar laugh. A fluffy white female with striking blue eyes immediately approached Thaddeus, rubbing against his legs and purring loudly. "That's Duchess," Skylar explained. "She's our official greeter. She loves everyone." Thaddeus bent down cautiously to stroke her fur, which was softer than he'd expected. Duchess arched into his touch, her purr intensifying. "She's very beautiful," he commented. "She is," Skylar agreed, "and very popular. We've had several applications for her, but we try to find the best match for each cat's personality. Duchess needs a home with lots of activity and attention. Thaddeus nodded, understanding the gentle hint that perhaps the sociable cat wasn't the best match for his quiet household. He continued his circuit of the room, watching a pair of black kittens wrestle playfully and a dignified older cat with grey whiskers groom himself meticulously. Each had charm, character. It would be easy to choose any of them. And then, as he was about to complete his loop of the room, something caught his eye. In the far corner, partially obscured by a worn blue blanket, was a small cubicle that he'd overlooked. Unlike the other spaces, this one seemed deliberately set apart. "What about that one?" he asked, pointing. Skylar's expression changed subtly. "That's Mosby," she said quietly. "He's a special case." Thaddeus moved closer to the cubicle. Inside, barely visible in the shadows, lay a thin grey cat. Unlike the others, this one made no sound, no movement. He simply existed, eyes half closed, as if conserving every ounce of energy just to breathe. "What happened to him?" Thaddeus asked, his voice dropping to match Skylar's hushed tone. "We found him about 3 weeks ago, hidden under the floorboards of an abandoned auto shop on Miller Road. We nearly missed him, actually. He didn't make a sound even when we got close." She shook her head. "He was so malnourished that Dr. Patel, our vet, wasn't sure he'd make it through the first night. He had infections, parasites. He'd been on his own for a long time." Thaddeus studied the cat, who hadn't moved or acknowledged their presence in any way. "How old is he?" "Dr. Patel thinks about 7 or 8, but it's hard to tell given his condition. He's healthier now than when we found him, but—" She trailed off. "But what?" Skylar hesitated. "Physically he's recovering, but mentally, emotionally, we're not sure he ever will. Some animals bounce back from trauma, others, it changes them. Mosby doesn't interact much. He doesn't play. He barely eats unless we're very persistent. It's like he's just given up." Something twisted in Thaddeus's chest. "Mosby. That's an unusual name." "One of our volunteers named him," Skylar explained. "She said he reminded her of Moss, the way he tries to blend into the background, silent, just existing. He's not aggressive, not scared exactly, just absent." Thaddeus stood before the cubicle, transfixed. The other cats continued their activities around him, playing, grooming, napping in patches of sunlight. But Mosby remained perfectly still, as if he were merely a shadow rather than a living creature. "May I?" Thaddeus gestured toward the cubicle door. Skylar looked surprised but nodded. "Of course, he won't scratch or bite. He just might not react at all." She unlatched the door, swinging it open slowly. Mosby didn't flinch, didn't look up, didn't seem to register the change. Thaddeus crouched down, his knees protesting slightly. He was not a young man anymore, and the position was uncomfortable, but something kept him there, eye level with this broken creature. "Hello, Mosby," he said softly. The cat's ear twitched slightly, the first indication that he was aware of anything happening around him. Slowly, carefully, Thaddeus extended his hand, palm up, fingers slightly curled. He didn't reach for the cat, just offered his presence. Time seemed to slow. Thaddeus was acutely aware of his breathing, of the distant sounds of traffic outside, of Skylar shifting her weight from one foot to the other beside him. But his focus remained on Mosby, who had finally, almost imperceptibly, turned his head toward the outstretched hand. Seconds stretched into a full minute. Then another. Thaddeus remained perfectly still, his hand steady. And then, with a movement so gradual it was barely perceptible, Mosby lifted his head. His eyes, a deep, muted green, focused on Thaddeus for the first time. There was no joy in them, no excitement, not even curiosity. Just a quiet, exhausted acknowledgement of another living being. The cat leaned forward, hesitant, and gently bumped his forehead against Thaddeus's fingers. It wasn't affection. It wasn't even really trust. It was something more fundamental, a surrender perhaps, an acceptance of whatever might come next, be it kindness or cruelty. Thaddeus felt something shift inside him, like a key turning in a lock he hadn't known existed. "This one," he said quietly, not looking away from Mosby. "I'd like to take this one." Skylar didn't hide her surprise. "Are you sure? I should warn you, he might never be a traditional pet. He might always be like this. Some cats who've been through trauma, especially prolonged trauma, never fully recover." Thaddeus nodded. "I understand." There are many other cats here who would be more responsive, more affectionate, easier, honestly. I'm sure they'll find wonderful homes, Thaddeus said, finally standing and turning to her. But I think Mosby and I might understand each other. An hour later, after paperwork and a brief discussion of care instructions, Thaddeus carried a pet carrier to his car. Inside, Mosby lay curled in the same blue blanket from his cubicle, which Skylar had insisted he take so he has something familiar. As he drove home, the carrier secure on the passenger seat, Thaddeus wondered what Doreen would think of his choice. She had always loved beautiful things. Her garden, her collection of colored glass bottles that caught the light, the handmade quilts she cherished. She would have been drawn to the orange tabby, perhaps, or the elegant Duchess. But then, Doreen had chosen him too, hadn't she? Not the most handsome man, not the most successful or exciting. Just steady, reliable Thaddeus, who loved her quietly and completely. "Well," he said to the silent carrier beside him, "I suppose we'll figure it out together." As he turned onto Maple Avenue, Thaddeus realized something startling. For the first time in 3 years, he was bringing something new into the house. Not just maintaining, not just preserving, but adding, changing. He wasn't sure if the thought terrified or liberated him. The first 3 days with Mosby passed in near silence. Thaddeus had set up everything according to Skylar's instructions: a litter box in the laundry room, food and water dishes in the kitchen, and a soft bed in the living room that Mosby had yet to use. The moment they'd arrived home and Thaddeus had opened the carrier, Mosby had slipped out like a wisp of smoke and vanished behind the refrigerator. Thaddeus had tried not to take it personally. "Take your time," he'd said to the gap between the refrigerator and the wall. "It's a big change." It was a big change for Thaddeus too, though in ways he hadn't anticipated. After 3 years of rigid routine, he suddenly found himself checking the food bowl throughout the day, refreshing water, keeping an ear tuned for any sound of movement. He would catch himself speaking aloud, narrating his actions as if Mosby were interested in the weather forecast, or why he preferred grape jelly to strawberry on his toast. The silence no longer felt quite so absolute. Even knowing another living being shared, the space changed the texture of the quiet. On the evening of the 3rd day, Thaddeus sat in his armchair with a dog-eared copy of Hemingway's The Old Man and the Sea. It had been Doreen's favorite book, though she'd always insisted the ending made her too sad. She kept it on her nightstand for years, rereading it every summer. After her death, he'd found he couldn't bear to open it. Tonight, though, he'd retrieved it from their bedroom, the first thing he'd removed from that preserved space in 3 years. "You know, Mosby," he said to the apparently empty room, "Doreen loved this book, said it reminded her that life is about the journey, not just what you bring back at the end." He cleared his throat and began to read aloud. He was an old man who fished alone in a skiff in the Gulf Stream, and he had gone 84 days now without taking a fish. He read for nearly an hour, his voice growing more confident as the pages turned. The familiar words were comforting, like speaking with an old friend. He could almost hear Doreen's gentle interruptions, her thoughts on Santiago's determination, her frustration with the sharks, her soft sigh at the final pages. When he finally closed the book, the living room was dark except for his reading lamp. He sat quietly for a moment, surprised by the peace he felt rather than the usual ache. As he stood to prepare for bed, a slight movement caught his eye. There, in the shadowed corner between the bookcase and the wall, sat Mosby. The cat was perfectly still again, but his eyes reflected the lamplight, 2 small green orbs in the darkness. Thaddeus froze, afraid any movement might send the cat back into hiding. "Hello there," he said softly. "Have you been listening?" Mosby blinked slowly, but remained where he was. "Well," Thaddeus continued, careful to keep his voice gentle, "I think I'll read some more tomorrow. You're welcome to join me again." He turned off the lamp and made his way to the guest room that had become his bedroom, moving with the practiced ease of someone who knows exactly where each piece of furniture stands in the dark. As he settled under the covers, he realized he was smiling faintly. It wasn't much, a cat sitting in a corner, listening, or perhaps just tolerating his presence. But it was something, a tiny crack in the isolation that had defined his life for 3 years. The next morning, Thaddeus noticed the food bowl was slightly less full than it had been the night before. The water level in the dish had dropped, and there were distinct paw prints in the litter. Small victories, but he found himself unreasonably pleased by these signs of life. He established a new routine over the following days: coffee and toast in the morning, the newspaper, household chores. But now, each evening after dinner, he would sit in his armchair and read aloud. Sometimes Hemingway, sometimes Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath, another of Doreen's favorites. He read even when he couldn't see Mosby, trusting that somewhere in the quiet house, the cat might be listening. A week passed this way. Mosby gradually expanded his territory, moving from behind the refrigerator to various shadowed corners of the kitchen and living room. He never approached Thaddeus, never invited touch, but he would sometimes sit in visible areas during the reading sessions, his thin body curled tightly as if trying to take up as little space as possible. On the 8th night, as Thaddeus read about Tom Joad's return home, a thunderstorm rolled in over Crestville. The rain came suddenly, hammering against the windows with unexpected force. A flash of lightning illuminated the room, followed by a crack of thunder that seemed to shake the very foundations of the house. Thaddeus paused in his reading, glancing at the window. "Quite a storm," he commented. A second louder thunderclap split the air, and then, so quickly that Thaddeus barely registered the movement, something shot across the living room floor and disappeared beneath his armchair. Setting the book aside, Thaddeus carefully leaned over to peer under the chair. There, pressed against the back wall, was Mosby, his thin body trembling visibly. "Ah," Thaddeus said softly. "Not a fan of thunder." Another flash, another boom. Mosby pressed himself even flatter against the floor. Without thinking, Thaddeus slid from the chair onto the floor, his back against the seat, legs stretched out on the rug. He didn't reach for the cat or try to coax him out. Instead, he simply continued reading, his voice deliberately steady and calm. "The fields were dusty and the sparse grass was dusty," he read. "The leaves of the willow were curled and dusty." The storm continued to rage outside, but Thaddeus kept reading, page after page, his voice a constant in the chaos of thunder and rain. Gradually, he became aware of a slight pressure against his ankle. Glancing down without moving his head, he saw that Mosby had crept forward just enough to press himself against Thaddeus's leg, still hiding under the chair, but seeking contact. Something warm and unexpected bloomed in Thaddeus's chest. Not happiness exactly, but a feeling adjacent to it, a sense of being useful, perhaps, needed in some small way. He continued to read until his voice grew hoarse, and the storm finally moved on, leaving only a gentle rain in its wake. Mosby remained pressed against his ankle long after the thunder had faded, only slipping away when Thaddeus finally had to stand. That night, for the first time since bringing Mosby home, Thaddeus didn't check all the cat's hiding places before going to bed. Something had shifted between them. A fragile trust had begun to form. In the darkest hour before dawn, Thaddeus woke to an unfamiliar sensation. Something was pressing gently against the foot of his bed. He lay still, listening to the soft patter of rain against the window, and gradually made out a shape in the darkness, Mosby, curled in a tight ball at the very edge of the mattress. "Well, hello," Thaddeus whispered. The cat didn't move, didn't acknowledge him, but he didn't run either. He simply stayed, a small, warm presence at the edge of Thaddeus's world. Thaddeus fell back asleep, with a curious lightness in his chest, as if something that had been wound tight for years had begun, very slowly, to unravel. The morning brought weak sunlight and puddles that reflected the blue sky. When Thaddeus woke again, Mosby was gone, but the indentation on the bedspread remained, proof that the night's events hadn't been a dream. As he made his coffee, Thaddeus noticed Mosby sitting in the doorway of the kitchen, watching him with those quiet green eyes. "Good morning," Thaddeus said. "Sleep well?" Mosby blinked slowly, which Thaddeus chose to interpret as a response. "I thought we might try something different today," Thaddeus continued, surprising himself. "The windows could use cleaning, and the garden, well, it's been neglected for too long." He hadn't touched Doreen's garden since her death. The rose bushes had grown wild, the flower beds choked with weeds. He'd paid a neighborhood boy to mow the lawn, but otherwise the backyard had become as frozen in time as the house itself. After breakfast, Thaddeus found himself standing at the back door, looking out at the overgrown yard. Doreen's gardening gloves lay where they'd always been, on the small table by the door. He picked them up, the leather stiff from disuse. "I'm not sure I remember how to do this," he said aloud. Doreen was the one with the green thumb, but he stepped outside anyway, the morning air cool against his face. Mosby, to his surprise, followed, slipping through the doorway like a shadow and taking up position on the weathered back step, watching as Thaddeus surveyed the tangled remains of what had once been a beautiful garden. It was overwhelming, seeing 3 years of neglect spread before him. But he started small, clearing away dead leaves from the stepping stone path, pulling the most obvious weeds from what had been the herb garden. He worked steadily through the morning, speaking occasionally to Mosby, who remained on the step, alert but calm. By noon, Thaddeus's back ached, and his hands were grimy despite the gloves, but a small section of the garden had been reclaimed from chaos. "Not bad for a first attempt," he told Mosby as they went back inside. "Though Doreen would probably laugh at my technique." He washed his hands at the kitchen sink, the dirt swirling down the drain. Looking out the window at the small, cleared patch in the wilderness of the backyard, he felt a curious mixture of melancholy and satisfaction. That night, as he read from The Grapes of Wrath, Mosby sat on the edge of the rug, still maintaining his distance but no longer hiding. When Thaddeus went to bed, he left the bedroom door slightly ajar, an invitation that hadn't existed before. And in the quiet hours of the night, he once again felt the gentle weight at the foot of his bed, a silent companion keeping watch through the darkness. 2 weeks after bringing Mosby home, Thaddeus received an unexpected call from Vianne. "Uncle Thad, it's me. I was just checking in. I haven't heard from you since our last call and I was getting a little worried." Thaddeus realized with a start that he'd missed their regular Tuesday call, something that hadn't happened once in 3 years. "I'm sorry, Vianne. I've been—" He paused, searching for the right word. "Distracted. Distracted." Her voice sharpened with concern. "Are you feeling all right? Do you need me to come over?" No, nothing like that," he assured her quickly. I visited that shelter you mentioned, Willow Haven." There was a beat of silence, then, "You did? When?" "Almost 2 weeks ago now. I adopted a cat." The excited squeal that came through the phone made Thaddeus hold the receiver away from his ear. When he cautiously returned it, Vianne was speaking rapidly. "Kind did you get? What color? Is it a boy or girl? What's its name?" "Uncle Thad, this is wonderful. I want to meet it. I can come over this weekend or sooner if—" "His name is Mosby," Thaddeus interrupted gently, "and he's still adjusting. He's very shy." "That's okay. I'll be quiet, I promise. Oh, Uncle Thad, I'm so happy you did this. Aunt Doreen would be thrilled." The mention of his wife brought a familiar pang, but it was softer now somehow. "Yes, I think she would," he agreed, "though she might question my choice. He's not exactly what most people would consider a beautiful cat." "What do you mean?" Thaddeus described Mosby, his thin grey form, his silent ways, the slow progress they were making together. As he spoke, he realized how much had changed in just 2 weeks. The cat that had hidden behind the refrigerator now followed him from room to room, though always at a distance. He still didn't seek affection, didn't play with the toys Thaddeus had purchased, but he was present in a way he hadn't been at first. "He sounds perfect," Vianne said when he finished. "Not in the conventional way, maybe, but perfect for you." "I suppose we're still figuring each other out," Thaddeus replied. They talked a little longer, with Vianne filling him in on town news and her work at the library. Before they hung up, she extracted a promise that she could visit when Mosby is ready, a concession Thaddeus appreciated. Somehow, he felt protective of the fragile peace he and the cat had established. That afternoon, Thaddeus continued his slow reclamation of the garden. Each day he tackled a small section, clearing away weeds, pruning back the most overgrown bushes, slowly revealing the bones of what had once been there. Mosby had taken to sitting on the back step during these sessions, occasionally venturing onto the grass to watch from a different angle. He never went far, always keeping Thaddeus in sight. "You know," Thaddeus said, as he carefully cut back a riot of wild morning glory that had overwhelmed one of Doreen's rose bushes, "I never thought I'd be doing this again." Doreen was the gardener. I just did the heavy lifting when she asked. He worked in silence for a while, the rhythmic snip of the pruning shears punctuating his thoughts. "She tried to teach me, of course. Doreen was a teacher at heart, 28 years in third-grade classrooms before she retired. He smiled at the memory. She'd tell me the names of everything she planted. Latin names, too, not just the common ones. I'd forget them immediately, and she'd just shake her head and tell me again the next time. A fat bumblebee droned past, investigating what remained of Doreen's lavender. Thaddeus watched it with mild interest. She always said gardens were forgiving. Make a mistake and next season you get a fresh start. Not everything in life works that way. He stood up, stretching his back, and was surprised to find Mosby sitting much closer than usual, just a few feet away, watching him with those solemn green eyes. "Well, hello there," Thaddeus said softly. "Interested in gardening, are you?" Carefully, moving with deliberate slowness, he lowered himself to sit on the grass, closing the distance between them by another foot. Mosby tensed but didn't retreat. They sat that way for several minutes, man and cat, regarding each other in the dappled shade of the old maple tree. A breeze stirred the overgrown grass around them, carrying the sweet scent of the neighbor's apple tree in bloom. "I think," Thaddeus said finally, "that we might be good for each other, you and I." Mosby's ear twitched, but he maintained his position, neither advancing nor retreating. It wasn't affection, not yet, but it was presence. And after 3 years of absence, the absence of Doreen, the absence of connection, the absence of forward motion, presence felt like a gift. The days began to develop a new rhythm. Mornings were for coffee and the newspaper, but now Mosby would sit on the kitchen counter, watching as Thaddeus moved about the room. Afternoons were spent in the garden when weather permitted, or reading aloud when it didn't. Evenings were for more reading, sometimes music from the old record player that had been silent for too long. Doreen's records, folk music mostly, with some classical and the occasional Broadway soundtrack, had remained untouched on their shelf since her death. One evening, almost 3 weeks after Mosby's arrival, Thaddeus found himself standing before them, running a finger along their spines. "She loved music," he told Mosby, who sat watching from the doorway. "Especially on rainy Sundays. She'd put on Joni Mitchell or Joan Baez and sing along while she baked bread." He selected a record, Simon and Garfunkel's Bridge Over Troubled Water, and carefully placed it on the turntable. The opening piano notes of the title track filled the room, crisp and clear despite the years of silence. Thaddeus closed his eyes, transported instantly to Sunday afternoons with Doreen, the house filled with the scent of rising dough and the sound of her slightly off-key singing. The memory was vivid, painfully so, but for the first time, it brought more warmth than sorrow. When he opened his eyes, he was startled to find Mosby sitting directly at his feet, looking up at him with an intensity that hadn't been there before. As October gave way to November, subtle changes continued to unfold in the house on Maple Avenue. The most noticeable was the gradual thawing between Thaddeus and Mosby. While the cat still maintained his reserve, he had begun to establish routines that increasingly involved Thaddeus. Each morning, as Thaddeus sipped his coffee at the kitchen table, Mosby would perch on the windowsill, gazing out at the bird feeder Thaddeus had recently hung. His tail would occasionally twitch when a cardinal or chickadee landed, but he made no predatory moves, content, it seemed, to simply observe the world beyond the glass. In the afternoons, when Thaddeus worked in the garden, which was slowly emerging from years of neglect, Mosby would follow at a careful distance, sometimes settling on a sunny patch of cleared earth to watch. And in the evenings, as Thaddeus read aloud or played Doreen's old records, the cat would position himself progressively closer to the armchair, first against the wall, then by the bookcase, then finally at the edge of the rug. It was during these evening sessions that Thaddeus found himself speaking more freely than he had in years. The cat's undemanding presence loosened something within him, allowing words to flow that had been dammed up since Doreen's passing. "She loved this song," Thaddeus told Mosby one evening, as Judy Collins's Both Sides Now filled the living room. Said it reminded her that perspectives change as you get older. What seems like a failure at 30 might look like a necessary step at 60. Mosby blinked slowly. His thin body relaxed in a patch of lamplight. "I wonder what she'd think of me now," Thaddeus continued, his voice dropping. Talking to a cat, finally cleaning up her garden. Moving her things after keeping them like museum exhibits for 3 years. For that was another change, small but significant. Thaddeus had begun tentatively to touch the sacred preserved spaces of the house. Doreen's reading glasses, which had sat untouched on the side table for 3 years, were now carefully stored in their case in the drawer. Her coat still hung by the door, but he had gently brushed it and straightened the collar. The door to their bedroom remained closed, but no longer felt like a sealed tomb. He had entered twice in the past week, opening the curtains to let fresh air circulate. These weren't large gestures, but each felt monumental, like moving stones that had been weighing him down for years. On a particularly cold Tuesday in mid-November, Thaddeus woke to find that the season's first snow had fallen overnight. A thin blanket of white covered the garden, transforming the partially reclaimed space into something new and pristine. Mosby sat on the windowsill in the living room, his attention fixed on the transformed landscape. "First snow," Thaddeus commented, coming to stand beside him. Doreen always said the first snow made everything clean again, even if just for a little while. He studied the cat's profile, noting with satisfaction that Mosby's ribs were no longer quite so prominent. The regular meals and peaceful environment had begun to restore him physically, even if his spirit remained cautious. "I need to go into town today," Thaddeus continued. "We're running low on a few things, and I should probably pick up something more substantial for your dinner. Skylar mentioned you might like some real fish occasionally, not just the canned food." Mosby turned to look at him, and for a moment, Thaddeus had the distinct impression that the cat understood every word. "I won't be long," he promised, feeling slightly foolish for explaining his plans to a cat, yet compelled to do so anyway. The drive into town was pleasant, the world transformed by snow into something quieter and more gentle. Thaddeus found himself noticing details he'd overlooked for years: the intricate Victorian trim on the old Masonic lodge, the new mural on the side of the elementary school, the holiday decorations beginning to appear in shop windows. At the grocery store he took his time, adding items to his cart that hadn't been on his shopping list in years: fresh vegetables, a small piece of salmon from the fish counter, a potted rosemary plant that reminded him of the herb garden Doreen had lovingly tended. As he was examining apples in the produce section, a familiar voice called his name. "Thaddeus Avner, is that you?" He turned to find Margaret Holloway smiling at him. She had been Doreen's closest friend, the two of them having taught at the same elementary school for over 20 years. After the funeral, Margaret had tried to stay in touch, inviting him to Sunday dinners, checking in with phone calls. But Thaddeus had gradually withdrawn, finding it too painful to maintain connections to Doreen's life without her. "Margaret," he said, genuinely pleased to see her. "How are you?" "I'm well, just preparing for the grandchildren's Thanksgiving visit." She studied his face with undisguised curiosity. "You look different, Thaddeus." "Good, different." He wasn't sure how to respond to that. Did he look different? He still wore the same clothes, still had the same face he saw in the mirror each morning. But perhaps there was something else, something less tangible that had changed. "I've been working in the garden," he said finally. "Getting it back in order?" Margaret's eyes widened slightly. "Doreen would be pleased," she said softly. Then, with a slight hesitation, "I've missed seeing you, Thaddeus. We all have. The old teaching crew still meets for lunch on the first Wednesday of the month at Malone's Diner. You'd be welcome to join us." In the past, such an invitation would have sent him retreating immediately. The thought of sitting at a table full of Doreen's friends, all of them remembering her, all of them noticing her absence, it would have been unbearable. But now he found himself considering it. "Perhaps sometime," he said, surprising both Margaret and himself. "Thank you for the invitation." They chatted for a few more minutes, with Margaret filling him in on mutual acquaintances and town news. When they parted, she squeezed his arm gently. "Don't be a stranger, Thaddeus. Doreen wouldn't want that." The interaction left him thoughtful as he finished his shopping and drove home. Was Margaret right? Would Doreen have wanted him to re-emerge into the world? Or was that just something people said to widowers, a gentle pressure to conform to expectations of moving on? As he pulled into his driveway, he noticed a figure on his front porch, Vianne, bundled in a bright red coat, stamping her feet against the cold. "Uncle Thad," she called as he got out of the car. "I was beginning to think you weren't home." "Just went for groceries," he explained, gathering bags from the trunk. "Here, let me get the door." Inside, he set the bags on the kitchen counter and turned to his niece, who was unwinding a long purple scarf from around her neck. "I hope you don't mind me dropping by," she said. "I was in the neighborhood for a meeting at the community center, and I thought, well, I'm dying to meet Mosby." As if summoned by his name, a grey shadow appeared in the doorway between the kitchen and the living room. Mosby surveyed the scene cautiously, his body tense. "There he is," Thaddeus said quietly. "Remember, Vianne, he's very shy. Don't make any sudden movements." Vianne, to her credit, remained perfectly still, only her eyes moving as she took in the thin grey cat. "He's beautiful," she said softly. Thaddeus was surprised by her assessment. Beautiful wasn't a word he'd have used for Mosby, whose coat was dull rather than sleek, whose frame still showed the effects of his hard life. But looking at him through Vianne's eyes, he could see a certain austere elegance in the cat's posture, a dignity in his reserve. "He's getting more comfortable," Thaddeus said, "but he's still cautious around new people." "That's understandable," Vianne replied, still watching Mosby. "After what he's been through." Mosby held his position in the doorway, clearly assessing this new human. After a long moment, he turned and disappeared back into the living room. "Sorry," Thaddeus began, but Vianne shook her head. "Don't apologize. That he even showed himself with a stranger here is progress." She smiled at her uncle. "And speaking of progress, this place feels different, Uncle Thad. You've been cleaning?" He nodded, suddenly self-conscious. He had been cleaning, not just the routine maintenance he'd kept up over the years, but deeper organization. Clearing out old newspapers, dusting shelves that had been neglected, even rearranging some furniture to create more open space. "And is that a new plant?" Vianne pointed to the rosemary he'd just purchased. "Just picked it up today. Thought it might be nice to have something green in here during the winter." Vianne's smile widened. "It looks like having Mosby has been good for you." "We're figuring each other out," Thaddeus replied, beginning to unpack the groceries. Vianne stayed for a cup of tea, chatting about her work at the library and the upcoming holiday plans. When she left an hour later, she hugged Thaddeus tightly. "I'm proud of you, Uncle Thad," she whispered. "Really proud." After she drove away, Thaddeus stood in the entryway, a curious lightness in his chest. He wasn't sure he'd done anything to merit pride, but the sentiment warmed him nonetheless. He found Mosby in the living room, curled on the armchair, Thaddeus's armchair, watching him with those inscrutable green eyes. "Well," Thaddeus said, "that was different." He moved to the kitchen to prepare dinner, including a small portion of the fresh salmon for Mosby. As he worked, he realized he was humming, a soft, tuneless sound that nonetheless broke the silence in a way that felt right. The snow continued to fall outside, soft flakes drifting past the windows and gathering on the sills. Inside, the house felt warmer than it had in years, as if something frozen had finally begun to thaw. After dinner, as Thaddeus settled into his armchair for their evening reading session, displacing Mosby, who relocated to the rug without complaint, he found himself turning not to Hemingway or Steinbeck, but to a volume of poetry that had been Doreen's. "Let's try something different tonight," he told the cat, who regarded him with what might have been curiosity. "Doreen loved Mary Oliver, said she captured the way small moments can contain whole universes." He opened the book to a dog-eared page and began to read aloud. The poem spoke of attention, of the sacred in the ordinary, of the way nature offers endless second chances. "Doesn't everything die at last and too soon?" Thaddeus read, his voice catching slightly on the words. "Tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life?" He closed the book, the question hanging in the air between them. Mosby watched him steadily, his gaze neither judgmental nor expectant, simply present. "I don't know," Thaddeus admitted finally, answering both the poem and the unasked question in the cat's eyes. "I truly don't know. But perhaps it's time to find out." That night, for the first time since bringing Mosby home, Thaddeus felt the cat's weight settle not just at the foot of the bed, but alongside him, a warm presence against his side. Neither of them moved to close the small gap that remained between them, but they breathed together in the darkness, two solitary creatures finding comfort in proximity. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the garden in a blank white canvas, ready for whatever might come next. December arrived with biting winds and early sunsets that painted Crestville in shades of gold and purple. Thaddeus found himself settling into new routines that were quietly revolutionary in their normalcy. He cooked proper meals now, nothing fancy, but actual cooking rather than microwaving. He read the newspaper front to back, not just skimming headlines. He even attended the town's annual tree lighting ceremony, standing at the back of the crowd with a thermos of hot coffee, watching as the massive pine in the square blazed to life with thousands of tiny white lights. Mosby, too, continued his gradual transformation. He had begun to explore the house more confidently, finding favorite perches. The back of the sofa, where afternoon sun created a warm spot, the windowsill in the kitchen that offered views of the bird feeder, and most surprisingly, the shelf in the living room where Doreen's collection of paperweights was displayed. He was still quiet, still reserved, but there were moments now, brief flashes of what might be called personality. A particular chirping sound he made when Thaddeus opened a can of tuna, the way he would watch intently whenever Thaddeus tied his shoelaces, as if the moving strings were the most fascinating thing imaginable. His habit of sitting on whatever book or newspaper Thaddeus had just set down, claiming it as his territory. They had achieved a comfortable coexistence, these two damaged souls. Not quite healed, perhaps, but no longer quite so broken. It was on a particularly cold Thursday, with snow falling in thick, wet flakes, that their peaceful routine was interrupted by an unexpected knocking at the front door. Thaddeus, who had been reading by the fireplace with Mosby curled on the rug nearby, looked up in surprise. He wasn't expecting Vianne. She had called the previous evening to say she'd be out of town until Sunday, visiting a college friend in Columbus. The knocking came again, more insistent this time. "Coming," Thaddeus called, setting aside his book and rising stiffly. His knees protested the movement after hours of sitting. When he opened the door, he found a tall, broad-shouldered man in his early 30s standing on his porch, snow dusting his dark wool coat. The man's face was flushed from the cold, his expression a mixture of concern and embarrassment. "Mr. Avner," the man asked. "I'm Arliss Tanner. I moved in next door about 3 months ago." He gestured vaguely toward the house to the right of Thaddeus's. "I hate to bother you, but I'm in a bit of a situation, and I was hoping you might be able to help." Thaddeus vaguely recalled seeing moving vans at the neighboring house back in September, but he'd paid little attention. The house had changed hands several times since old Mr. Flannery had moved to Florida 5 years ago. "What kind of situation?" Thaddeus asked, not unkindly but with natural caution. Arliss ran a hand through his snow-dampened hair. "I locked myself out. My spare key is at my sister's in Cincinnati, and I can't reach her. I've tried calling a locksmith, but with the weather, they're saying it could be hours before they can get here." He gave a rueful smile. "I was wondering if I could wait somewhere warm. I'd go to a coffee shop, but my car's in the garage, and with the snow—" Thaddeus hesitated only briefly. In the past, he might have found an excuse, maintaining the fortress of solitude his home had become, but something had shifted in him these past weeks. "Of course," he said, stepping back. "Come in out of the cold." Relief washed over Arliss's face. "Thank you. I really appreciate it." As the younger man stamped the snow from his boots and entered, Thaddeus noticed Mosby watching warily from the hallway, his body tense. "That's Mosby," Thaddeus explained. "He's not used to visitors. He'll probably disappear for a while." As if confirming his words, the cat slipped silently away, vanishing into the shadows of the house. "You have a cat?" Arliss seemed surprised. "I wouldn't have guessed. You seem more like a serious book and pipe kind of man." Thaddeus found himself chuckling at the assessment. "I do read quite a bit, though I've never taken up a pipe, but Mosby is a recent addition. We've only been together about 2 months." He led Arliss to the kitchen, where he put on a kettle for tea. As he moved around the familiar space, he was aware of his guest taking in the details of the house. The dated wallpaper in the hallway, the old-fashioned furniture, the photographs on the walls that hadn't been updated in years. "Have you lived here long?" Arliss asked, accepting the offered seat at the kitchen table. 41 years, Thaddeus replied, surprising himself with the realization. "My wife and I bought it the year after we were married." Arliss's gaze moved to Thaddeus's left hand, noting the gold band he still wore. "Is your wife at work?" A familiar pang, but duller now. "She passed away 3 years ago. Car accident." "I'm sorry," Arliss said, genuine regret in his voice. "That must have been incredibly difficult." Thaddeus nodded, busying himself with the tea preparations. "It was. It still is sometimes. But—" he paused, considering his next words carefully. "Life continues, whether we're ready for it to or not." He placed a mug of steaming tea before Alice, who accepted it gratefully. "I know something about that," the younger man said quietly. "My partner Daniel died 5 years ago. Cancer." He wrapped his hands around the mug, as if drawing more than just physical warmth from it. "That's actually why I moved here. Needed a fresh start somewhere with no memories." Thaddeus felt a flicker of recognition, a sense of kinship with this stranger. "And has it helped? The fresh start?" Alice considered the question, his expression thoughtful. "Sometimes. Other times, I feel like I've just relocated the emptiness." He gave a small, self-deprecating smile. "Sorry. That's probably more than you wanted to know about your new neighbor." "Not at all," Thaddeus assured him. "I understand more than you might think." They sat in surprisingly comfortable silence for a moment, sipping their tea. Outside, the snow continued to fall, transforming the world into a soft, white landscape. "So, what do you do, Mr. Tanner?" Thaddeus asked eventually. "Alice, please, and I'm a high school music teacher. Just started at Crestville High this fall." "Music?" "Doreen, my wife. She loved music. Played the piano and had quite the record collection." Thaddeus gestured vaguely toward the living room, where the old record player sat. Alice's eyes lit up. "Really? What kind of music?" "Folk, mostly. Joan Baez, Joni Mitchell, some classical. Chopin was her favorite." "Excellent taste," Alice approved. "I teach orchestra and band, but I play piano myself. Haven't had room for one since I moved, though. My apartment in Columbus had space, but this house, while nice, is more compact." Thaddeus found himself saying something unexpected. "We have a piano. It was Doreen's. No one's played it in 3 years, but it's still there. Still in tune, I think. She was particular about that." Alice's expression brightened. "Really? I'd love to see it sometime if that wouldn't be imposing." "It's in the living room, actually." Thaddeus stood, surprising himself again with the impulse to share this piece of Doreen with a stranger. "Would you like to see it now?" The younger man followed him into the living room, where Doreen's upright piano stood against the far wall. It was a beautiful instrument, cherry wood polished to a warm glow, the keys yellowed slightly with age, but still elegant. "It's lovely," Alice said, approaching it with obvious appreciation. "Steinway? That's a quality instrument." Thaddeus nodded. It was her grandmother's, then hers. She played every day. He ran a hand along the closed lid, remembering. "The house feels quieter without her music." Alice nodded in understanding. "Music fills spaces that nothing else can reach." He glanced at Thaddeus. "Would it be all right if I—" Thaddeus hesitated only briefly. "Please," he said, stepping back. Alice sat at the bench, adjusting its height slightly. He opened the lid, revealing the keys that had been hidden for 3 years. Then, with a respectful nod to Thaddeus, he began to play. The piece was something gentle and melancholy, notes flowing into each other like water over stones. Thaddeus didn't recognize it, but it seemed to capture perfectly the feeling of snow falling outside, of memories drifting through a quiet house, of life continuing in its imperfect way. As the music filled the room, something moved in the doorway. Mosby had reappeared, drawn perhaps by the unfamiliar sounds. He sat perfectly still, watching Alice's fingers move across the keys with an intensity that seemed almost like recognition. The piece ended, the final notes hanging in the air like a question. "That was beautiful," Thaddeus said quietly. "What was it?" "Einaudi," Alice replied. "Contemporary Italian composer. That piece is called I Giorni, the days." He noticed Mosby in the doorway and smiled. "Looks like your cat approves." Thaddeus followed his gaze, surprised to see Mosby had ventured further into the room, closer to the piano than he would normally approach a stranger. He's never heard the piano before, Thaddeus realized aloud. Not since he's been here anyway. "Music affects animals too," Alice said. "When Daniel was in hospice, we had a therapy cat that would visit. She would always come sit by him when the music therapist played." The mention of hospice, of final days, might once have made Thaddeus retreat emotionally, but now he found himself nodding, understanding the comfort that could be found in such moments. "Would you play something else?" he asked. "If you don't mind." Alice smiled, turning back to the keys. "Any requests?" Thaddeus thought for a moment. "Do you know any Chopin?" Doreen loved his nocturnes. As a matter of fact, I do. The music began again, a familiar nocturne that Doreen had played often on quiet evenings. Thaddeus closed his eyes, letting the melody wash over him. It hurt, yes, but it was a clean hurt, like the sting of antiseptic on a wound too long left untended. When he opened his eyes again, he found that Mosby had moved to sit directly beside the piano bench, closer to Arliss than he had ever voluntarily come to a stranger. The cat's posture was alert but relaxed, his gaze fixed on the moving keys. The piece ended, and Arliss turned to find the cat so near. "Well, hello there," he said softly, keeping his hands on the keys. "You're a music lover, I see." Mosby regarded him steadily, making no move to retreat. "He doesn't usually approach people," Thaddeus explained, amazed by this development. "You must have a way with cats as well as pianos." Arliss laughed. "Music soothes the savage beast, they say. Though your Mosby doesn't look very savage to me, just cautious." The ringing of a cell phone interrupted the moment. Arliss pulled his phone from his pocket, glancing at the screen. "It's the locksmith," he explained, answering the call. After a brief conversation, he stood from the piano bench. "They can get to me in about 20 minutes. The roads are clearing up." "That's good news," Thaddeus said, surprised to find he wasn't entirely glad the visit was coming to an end. It had been pleasant having company, different but not unwelcome. "Thank you for the rescue," Arliss said as they moved back toward the entryway. "For the tea and the piano and the company." "It was no trouble," Thaddeus assured him. Then, after a moment's hesitation, he added, Perhaps you'd like to come play the piano again sometime. It shouldn't sit unused, and I'm sure Doreen would prefer to know it was bringing someone joy." Arliss looked genuinely touched by the offer. "I'd like that very much, Mr. Avner." "Thaddeus, please, or Thad, if you prefer. Mr. Avner makes me feel like I'm back teaching hardware customers about the difference between Phillips and flathead screwdrivers." Arliss laughed. "Thad it is, then. And I'd be honored to play Doreen's piano again." They exchanged phone numbers, and Thaddeus stood at the door watching as his new neighbor made his way carefully down the snowy path. As he closed the door against the cold, he felt Mosby brush against his ankle. A fleeting touch, gone almost before he registered it, but unmistakable. "Well," Thaddeus said to the cat, who looked up at him with those solemn green eyes, "that was unexpected." Mosby blinked slowly, which Thaddeus had come to interpret as agreement. Later that evening, as they settled into their usual positions for reading time, Thaddeus reflected on the day's events. His home, which had been a mausoleum to memory for so long, had been filled with music again. A stranger, no, a neighbor, had sat at Doreen's piano and brought it back to life. And Mosby, his cautious, damaged companion, had shown curiosity rather than fear. Small steps, perhaps, but steps nonetheless. Moving forward rather than standing still. "I think," he told Mosby, who had ventured closer to the armchair than usual, "that we might be finding our way, you and I." The cat regarded him thoughtfully, then did something he had never done before. He rose from his spot on the rug, approached the armchair, and with a graceful leap, settled himself on the arm of the chair just inches from Thaddeus's shoulder. Not touching, not yet, but closer than ever before. Thaddeus carefully opened his book, mindful not to make any sudden movements that might startle his companion, and as he began to read aloud, he was aware of a warmth spreading through him that had nothing to do with the crackling fire in the hearth. The week before Christmas brought a heavy snowstorm that blanketed Crestville in nearly a foot of white. Schools closed, businesses sent workers home early, and the town settled into a hushed, expectant quiet. Thaddeus stood at his living room window, watching as the last light faded from the sky, turning the snow-covered yard into a landscape of blue shadows. Behind him, the house was warmer and brighter than it had been in years. A small Christmas tree, nothing elaborate, just a 3-foot Fraser fir in a simple stand, occupied the corner that had remained empty for the past 3 holiday seasons. Arliss had helped him select it at the lot behind the Methodist church, insisting that even a small celebration is better than none. The piano, no longer silent, was played regularly now. Arliss came by several evenings a week, sometimes bringing sheet music or a bottle of wine, filling the house with melodies that ranged from classical to contemporary. Mosby had developed a particular fondness for Debussy, often appearing from whatever corner of the house he'd been occupying as soon as the first notes of Clair de Lune sounded. Thaddeus had even, at Vianne's gentle urging, agreed to host a small Christmas Eve gathering. Just Vianne, Arliss, and Margaret Holloway, Doreen's old friend from the school whom he'd finally met for lunch the previous week. The thought of entertaining made him nervous, but not as terrified as it would have once. Now, watching the snow fall in the gathering darkness, Thaddeus felt a curious blend of melancholy and peace. The holidays would always carry an edge of sorrow without Doreen, but for the first time he found himself looking forward rather than back. A soft pressure against his ankle drew his attention downward. Mosby had approached silently, as was his way, and now leaned gently against Thaddeus's leg. "Evening," Thaddeus greeted him. "Thinking about going out in that snow? I wouldn't recommend it." It was a joke, of course. Mosby showed no interest in venturing outside beyond the occasional supervised expedition to the backyard on mild days. He was, at heart, a creature of warmth and safety. Understandably so, given his past. The cat looked up at him, those green eyes reflecting the lights from the small Christmas tree, then padded away toward the hallway. At the entrance, he paused, looking back over his shoulder as if expecting Thaddeus to follow. "Do you need something?" Thaddeus asked, amused by the cat's apparent expectation. Mosby continued down the hall, stopping again to look back. Curious, Thaddeus followed. The cat led him through the house with deliberate steps, pausing occasionally to ensure Thaddeus was still behind him. They passed the kitchen, the guest bathroom, the small study that had once been Doreen's sewing room. Finally, Mosby stopped before a door that had remained closed for 3 years, the master bedroom. Thaddeus felt his heart quicken. He had ventured inside a few times in recent weeks, always briefly, always with a sense of trespassing. He'd opened the curtains to air the room, had even removed a few items, Doreen's book from the nightstand, a sweater from the back of the chair. But he hadn't lingered, hadn't fully confronted the space they had shared for 4 decades. Mosby sat before the door, looking up at Thaddeus expectantly. "I don't know what you want," Thaddeus said quietly. "There's nothing for you in there." The cat remained where he was, patient and unwavering. With a sigh that was part resignation and part something else, something like acceptance, Thaddeus reached for the doorknob. It turned easily in his hand, and the door swung open on well-oiled hinges. The room beyond was dim, illuminated only by the faint glow of streetlights filtering through the curtains. Thaddeus reached for the light switch, hesitated, then flipped it on. Everything was exactly as it had been the morning Doreen left for her sister's house. The bedspread smoothed, since Doreen couldn't abide an unmade bed. Her jewelry box on the dresser closed but not locked. Her slippers beside the bed, positioned neatly as if awaiting her return. Mosby slipped past Thaddeus's legs and entered the room, his movements careful but deliberate. He explored methodically, under the bed, along the baseboards, behind the curtains, a thorough inspection of new territory. Thaddeus remained in the doorway, watching. He hadn't expected this moment to come tonight, hadn't prepared himself. Yet here he was, standing on the threshold of the room he'd both preserved and avoided for 3 long years. "It's just a room," he said aloud, though whether he was speaking to Mosby or himself wasn't clear. The cat, having completed his investigation, jumped lightly onto the bed and settled himself in the center of the quilt, a wedding gift from Doreen's grandmother, carefully preserved through decades of use. "That's her side," Thaddeus said automatically. Mosby regarded him steadily, neither moving nor showing any sign of understanding the significance of his chosen spot. He simply waited, as he had that first day at the shelter, with the patience of a creature who had learned that time passes, regardless of how one fills it. Slowly, with the careful movements of someone approaching something both precious and dangerous, Thaddeus entered the room. He moved to the dresser first, running a finger along its polished surface. A thin layer of dust had accumulated, despite his periodic cleaning of the house, evidence of the room's sacred, untouched status. On the dresser sat framed photographs, their wedding day, both of them impossibly young and solemn, a trip to the Grand Canyon for their 25th anniversary, squinting into the sun, Doreen in her garden, laughing as she held up a massive zucchini. Moments frozen in time, growing more distant with each passing day. Thaddeus picked up one of the frames, a photo of them dancing at Vianne's wedding 6 years ago. Doreen wore a blue dress that brought out her eyes, and she was looking up at him with an expression of such open affection that it made his chest ache to see it now. She was beautiful, he told Mosby, who watched from his position on the bed. Not in the movie star way, but in the way that matters. Her whole face lit up when she laughed, and she laughed often. He replaced the photo carefully, then moved to the closer. Doreen's clothes still hung there, protected by the cedar blocks she'd always placed among them to ward off moths. He touched the sleeve of a cardigan, soft blue cashmere that he'd given her for Christmas the year before she died. "I don't know what to do with all this," he admitted. "It feels wrong to get rid of it. But it feels wrong to keep it all too, like I'm expecting her to walk back in and need it." Mosby made a soft sound, almost a chirp, from the bed. I know. One step at a time." Thaddeus closed the closet door gently. Finally, he approached the bed. Mosby remained in place, watching as Thaddeus slowly lowered himself to sit on what had always been his side, the springs creaking slightly under his weight. "This was our room for 40 years, he said, his voice low. "We brought Vianne home from the hospital to a bassinet right there by the window. She stayed with us for the first 3 months before we move." The words seemed to catch in his throat as memories flooded back. "She stayed with us for the first 3 months, before we moved her to the nursery. Doreen would sit in that rocking chair by the window singing lullabies." He gestured to the chair in the corner, now draped with a shawl that hadn't been moved in 3 years. Mosby watched him with those steady green eyes that seemed to see far more than a cat should. "We had our biggest fight in this room," Thaddeus continued, finding it easier to speak than he'd expected. 1989, I wanted to take a job in Columbus. More money, bigger company. Doreen refused to leave Crestville, leave her students, her friends, the life we'd built. I was so angry, slept on the couch for 3 nights. He gave a soft laugh. She was right, of course. This was where we belonged. He ran a hand over the quilt, feeling the familiar texture of the fabric, the careful stitches that had held together through decades. The night before she died, we lay here talking about nothing important. The weather, a book she was reading, whether we should repaint the bathroom. His voice grew softer. "If I'd known it was our last conversation, would I have said something different? Something more meaningful?" Mosby shifted slightly, stretching out a paw to touch Thaddeus's hand, the first time the cat had deliberately initiated contact. The touch was brief, almost tentative, but unmistakable. "Thank you," Thaddeus whispered, unsure exactly what he was thanking the cat for, but feeling gratitude nonetheless. They sat together in the quiet room for a long time, surrounded by memories that no longer seemed quite so sharp-edged. Eventually, Thaddeus rose and moved to the window, drawing back the curtains to reveal the snow-covered world outside. Streetlights cast long shadows across the pristine white, and a few determined Christmas lights twinkled from neighboring houses. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" he said. "Doreen always loved the first heavy snow. Said it made the world look like a blank page, ready for a new story." He turned back to the room, seeing it now not just as a shrine to what had been lost, but as a space that had once held life and might do so again. Not the same life, that was impossible, but perhaps something new, something that honored the past while acknowledging the present. "I think," he said slowly, "that it's time to open these curtains for good. Let the light back in." Mosby, still on the bed, blinked in what Thaddeus chose to interpret as approval. That night, for the first time in 3 years, Thaddeus slept in the master bedroom. He didn't move Doreen's things from her nightstand, didn't disturb the arrangement of pillows on her side. But he occupied his own space again, reclaiming what had been his while respecting what had been hers. Mosby joined him, curling not at the foot of the bed as had become his habit in the guest room, but in the center, precisely between Thaddeus's side and Doreen's, neither fully on one nor the other, but bridging the space between. Thaddeus slept more deeply that night than he had in years, with no dreams that he could recall. When he woke to pale winter sunlight filtering through the curtains he'd left partially open, he felt different, lighter somehow, as if some invisible weight had shifted. Mosby was already awake, sitting on the windowsill and watching the birds at the feeder outside, his tail twitching occasionally with interest. "Good morning," Thaddeus said, his voice rough with sleep. The cat turned to look at him, and for the first time since bringing Mosby home, Thaddeus saw something new in those green eyes, a spark, a presence that hadn't been there before. Not quite happiness, perhaps, but engagement, awareness. It was a small change, but profound in its way. like the first green shoot breaking through frozen ground in spring, a promise of renewal, of life continuing despite the harshest winters. As Thaddeus made his way to the kitchen to prepare their breakfast, Mosby following close behind, he found himself thinking about the Christmas Eve gathering he'd agreed to host. Perhaps, he decided, he would play some of Doreen's records. Perhaps Margaret might share stories about their teaching days that he hadn't heard. Perhaps Vianne would bring those almond cookies she made every year. The ones Doreen had always claimed were better than her own. Perhaps it was time to create new memories in this house that had been frozen for too long. The days leading up to Christmas passed in a flurry of small activities that would have seemed inconsequential to anyone else, but represented seismic shifts in Thaddeus's world. He cleaned the house thoroughly. Not just the usual maintenance, but the kind of deep cleaning that Doreen had always insisted upon before company. Washing windows despite the cold, polishing silver that hadn't been used in years, even taking down the living room curtains to shake out the dust. Arliss came by several evenings, ostensibly to practice Christmas carols on the piano, but really, Thaddeus suspected, to check on him. The younger man had become a regular presence in the house, bringing with him not just music, but a comfortable sort of companionship that asked nothing and expected nothing. "You don't have to help, you know," Thaddeus told him one evening, as Arliss helped him untangle a string of lights for the small Christmas tree. "I'm sure you have your own holiday preparations." Arliss shrugged, his fingers working deftly to separate a particularly stubborn knot of wires. "Not really. Most of my family's in Oregon, too far for a quick visit, and I can't take enough time off work for a proper trip." He glanced up with a smile. "Besides, I like it here. It's peaceful." Mosby, who had initially been wary of Arliss, had gradually accepted the music teacher's presence. He would now sit on the piano bench beside him as he played, occasionally batting gently at the keys during pauses, as if offering his own musical contributions. "He likes you," Thaddeus observed, watching as Mosby pressed a single white key with deliberate precision. "Music is the universal language," Arliss replied with a grin. "Even cats understand it." The Friday before Christmas dawned clear and cold, the temperature dropping well below freezing overnight. Thaddeus woke early, his breath visible in the bedroom as he made his way to check the thermostat. The old furnace was struggling against the bitter cold, the house several degrees cooler than it should have been. "Need to get that looked at after the holidays," he muttered to himself, turning the dial up a few notches. Mosby seemed unbothered by the chill, his fur fluffed out against the cold as he performed his morning stretching routine on the living room rug. Thaddeus couldn't help but marvel at the change in the cat's physique over the past months. No longer gaunt, Mosby now had a healthy weight, his coat thicker and taking on a subtle luster that hadn't been there before. "You're looking quite distinguished these days," Thaddeus told him as he prepared their breakfast. "A far cry from that sad creature I met at Willow Haven." The morning passed quietly. Thaddeus made a shopping list for the Christmas Eve gathering, checked the forecast, more snow expected but nothing severe, and spent an hour sorting through a box of holiday decorations he'd found in the attic. Most were too painful still, the ornaments Doreen had collected over the years, each with its own story, the stockings with their names embroidered by her steady hand. But he set aside a few neutral pieces, a silver candle holder, a ceramic bowl for potpourri, a wreath for the front door. By mid-afternoon, with the winter sun already beginning its descent, Thaddeus decided to venture into town for the last of his shopping. The roads had been cleared, and he needed to pick up the small gifts he'd ordered for Vianne and his other guests. "I won't be long," he told Mosby, who was curled on the sofa, watching him with mild interest. "Hold down the fort while I'm gone." The town centre was bustling with last-minute shoppers, the storefronts decorated with wreaths and lights. Thaddeus found himself moving through the crowd with less discomfort than he would have felt even a month ago, exchanging nods with familiar faces, even stopping briefly to chat with his former assistant from the hardware store. At the bookshop, he collected the special edition of poetry he'd ordered for Vianne. At the music store, he picked up vintage sheet music for Arliss, Chopin nocturnes that he thought the young man might enjoy playing on Doreen's piano. For Margaret, he'd found a delicate teacup at the antique store that reminded him of one Doreen had admired in Margaret's collection years ago. Small gestures but meaningful, connections being re-established, thread by fragile thread. His final stop was the grocery store, where he collected ingredients for the simple meal he planned to serve. a roast chicken with vegetables, rolls from the bakery, and a pie he'd ordered from the diner, where Doreen had always claimed they made crust, just like my mother's. By the time he headed home, darkness had fallen completely, and the temperature had dropped even further. The car's heater struggled to keep up, blowing air that was barely warm enough to fog the windows. Thaddeus drove carefully, mindful of patches of black ice that might lurk on the roads. As he turned onto Maple Avenue, he noticed activity at his house, flashing lights, a vehicle in the driveway. For a moment, his heart seized with an irrational fear that something had happened to Mosby. But as he drew closer, he realized it wasn't an emergency vehicle, but rather Arliss's car, and the lights were just the reflection of Christmas decorations in the windows. Puzzled, Thaddeus pulled up behind Arliss's sedan and gathered his shopping bags. The cold hit him like a physical blow as he stepped out of the car, the wind cutting through his coat and making his eyes water. As he approached his front door, it swung open to reveal Arliss looking concerned. "Thad, thank goodness, I've been trying to call you." Thaddeus patted his coat pocket, realizing he'd left his cell phone on the charger in the kitchen. "Sorry, I forgot my phone." "What's wrong?" "It's Mosby," Arliss said, stepping back to let Thaddeus enter. "I came over to drop off a Christmas card, and I found him acting strangely. He was at the front window, pacing and meowing. I could hear him from outside." Thaddeus frowned, setting down his bags. "Meowing? He hardly ever makes a sound." "I know, that's why I was concerned. I used the spare key you gave me to check on him, and he's been acting agitated ever since. Pacing, vocalizing, trying to get my attention." As if summoned by their discussion, Mosby appeared in the hallway, immediately rushing to Thaddeus and weaving between his legs, behavior so uncharacteristic that Thaddeus knew instantly something was wrong. "What is it, boy?" he asked, bending down despite the protest of his knees. Mosby darted away a few steps, then looked back, meowing loudly, a sound Thaddeus had rarely heard from him. "I think he wants you to follow him," Arliss said. "He was doing the same thing to me earlier, but I wasn't sure what he was trying to show me." Concerned now, Thaddeus followed as Mosby led him through the house, moving with urgency rather than his usual deliberate pace. The cat headed straight for the garden door at the back of the house, where he began scratching insistently. "He wants to go outside, in this weather." Thaddeus was bewildered. Mosby had shown no interest in venturing outdoors in the bitter cold. "Maybe there's an animal out there that's bothering him," Arliss suggested. "A raccoon or stray cat." Thaddeus hesitated, then opened the door slightly, expecting Mosby to retreat from the blast of cold air. Instead, the cat shot through the opening and out into the snow-covered yard. "Mosby!" Thaddeus called, alarmed. "Come back, it's freezing out there." But the cat was already crossing the yard, his grey form almost invisible against the gathering darkness. Only the disturbance in the snow marked his path. "I'd better go after him," Thaddeus said, reaching for his coat. "He's not an outdoor cat. He could get lost or hurt." "I'll come with you," Arliss offered immediately, already zipping his own coat. They hurried into the yard, following Mosby's tracks. The cat had headed toward the back fence, where a gap separated Thaddeus's property from his neighbor on the other side. Not Arliss, but the Pattersons, an elderly couple who had lived there for as long as Thaddeus could remember. "Mosby!" Thaddeus called again, his breath fogging in the frigid air. A loud, insistent meow answered him from beyond the fence. Peering through the gap, Thaddeus could just make out Mosby's form in the Pattersons' yard, pacing back and forth beside what looked like a dark heap in the snow. "There's something over there," he told Arliss. "I need to see what it is." The gap in the fence was narrow, but Thaddeus managed to squeeze through, Arliss following close behind. As they approached, Thaddeus realized with a shock that the dark heap was a person, Herbert Patterson lying face down in the snow beside the bird feeder he must have been filling when he collapsed. "Mr. Patterson!" Thaddeus rushed forward, kneeling beside the still form. "Herbert, can you hear me?" The elderly man was unconscious, his skin alarmingly cold to the touch, but when Thaddeus pressed fingers to his neck, he detected a pulse, faint but present. "He's alive," he told Arliss, "but barely. We need an ambulance." Arliss already had his phone out, dialing 911 with fingers made clumsy by cold and urgency. As he reported the emergency, Thaddeus removed his own coat and laid it over Patterson's body, trying to provide some protection against the killing cold. Mosby stood nearby, watching intently. no longer meowing now that Thaddeus had found what he was trying to show him. "Good boy," Thaddeus said softly. "You did good, Mosby. You found him." The cat blinked slowly, then moved closer, pressing against Thaddeus's leg as if offering support. "They're sending an ambulance," Arliss reported, putting away his phone. "And I called Mrs. Patterson. She's at her daughter's house in town. She's on her way home now." "He must have been out here for a while," Thaddeus said, noting the thin layer of snow covering parts of Patterson's clothing. "If Mosby hadn't alerted us—" He didn't finish the thought. They both knew what would have happened. Herbert Patterson, 83 years old and already frail from a recent bout of pneumonia, would not have survived much longer in the brutal cold. "How did your cat know?" Arliss wondered, looking at Mosby with new respect. "He's never even been in their yard, has he?" Thaddeus shook his head. "Never. He barely goes in our backyard and only when I'm with him." He looked at Mosby, who sat calmly in the snow, seemingly unbothered by the cold now that his mission was accomplished. I have no idea how he knew. The wait for the ambulance felt interminable, though in reality it was less than 10 minutes. Thaddeus and Arliss took turns checking Patterson's pulse, reassuring themselves that he still clung to life. Mosby remained close by, a silent sentinel in the gathering darkness. When the ambulance finally arrived, lights flashing and sirens silent, no need to announce an emergency in the quiet neighborhood, the paramedics worked quickly, assessing Patterson's condition and carefully loading him onto a stretcher. "Hypothermia, probable cardiac event," one of them told Thaddeus. "You found him just in time. Another half-hour out here." He left the rest unsaid. As they wheeled Patterson toward the waiting ambulance, Mrs. Patterson's car pulled into the driveway, and she rushed toward them, her face etched with worry. "Herbert! Oh my God, Herbert!" She reached for her husband's hand, her own trembling visibly. "He's stable for now, Mum," the paramedic assured her. "We're taking him to Mercy General. You can follow us there." Mrs. Patterson turned to Thaddeus, confusion mixing with gratitude. "How did you find him?" "I've been calling the house for hours with no answer." "It wasn't me," Thaddeus admitted. "It was my cat, Mosby. Somehow he knew Mr. Patterson was in trouble." The elderly woman's eyes widened. "A cat? Your cat saved my Herbert." "He alerted us," Arliss explained. "Led us right to him." Mrs. Patterson looked past them to where Mosby sat, watching the proceedings with those inscrutable green eyes. That is a miracle," she said softly. "Her Christmas miracle." The paramedics called to her, and with a final squeeze of Thaddeus's arm, she hurried to join her husband in the ambulance. Thaddeus, Arliss, and Mosby watched as the vehicle pulled away, its lights cutting through the darkness like a promise of hope. "We should get inside," Arliss said after a moment. "It's freezing out here." Thaddeus nodded, suddenly aware of the cold seeping through his clothes. He'd given his coat to Patterson, and the temperature seemed to have dropped even further in the last hour. "Come on, Mosby," he called. "Let's go home." To his surprise, the cat trotted immediately to his side, walking close enough that his fur occasionally brushed against Thaddeus's pant leg, a deliberate contact that was new and significant. Back inside the warmth of the house, Thaddeus found himself shaking, not just from cold, but from the weight of what had happened. If Mosby hadn't somehow sensed Patterson's distress, if Arliss hadn't come by to drop off a card, if Thaddeus had stayed out shopping longer— "Sit down," Arliss instructed gently, guiding Thaddeus to the sofa. "I'll make some tea. Something stronger if you have it." Thaddeus nodded. "There's bourbon in the cabinet above the refrigerator. Doreen used it for her hot toddies when we had colds." As Arliss disappeared into the kitchen, Mosby jumped onto the sofa beside Thaddeus, not at the far end, as had been his habit, but directly next to him. And then, in a movement so natural it seemed impossible it had never happened before, the cat settled against Thaddeus's side, pressing the length of his body against him. Thaddeus held perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe. Then, slowly, he placed a hand on Mosby's back. The cat didn't flinch, didn't pull away. Instead, he began to purr, a rusty, unused sound as if remembering how after a long time of silence. "You saved a life today," Thaddeus told him softly. "How did you know, Mosby? How did you know he needed help?" The cat looked up at him, and in that moment Thaddeus would have sworn he saw understanding in those green eyes, a wisdom that transcended species, that spoke of shared experiences and shared pain. Arliss returned with 2 mugs, steam rising from them in aromatic spirals. "Hot tea with a generous splash of bourbon," he announced, then stopped, taking in the scene before him. "Well, would you look at that?" he said softly. Thaddeus accepted the mug with his free hand, unwilling to disturb Mosby with too much movement. "Thank you for everything today." Arliss sat in the armchair across from them. "No thanks needed. That's what neighbors are for." He nodded toward Mosby. "He's the real hero. I've heard of animals sensing when people are in medical distress, but I've never seen it firsthand." "He was trying so hard to tell us," Thaddeus marveled. "All that meowing, the pacing. He knew something was wrong." "Animals have senses we don't fully understand," Arliss said. "Maybe he heard something, or maybe it's just instinct." Thaddeus sipped his tea, feeling the bourbon's warmth spread through him. Whatever it was, Herbert Patterson owes his life to a cat that most people wouldn't look at twice. He stroked Mosby's back gently. A cat that almost didn't get a second chance himself. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. That this cat, so damaged and withdrawn that he'd been hidden away at the shelter, overlooked by families seeking more obviously appealing pets, had proven to have a heightened awareness that transcended his trauma. "I went to the shelter looking for company," Thaddeus said after a long moment. "I never expected this." Arliss smiled. "Life rarely gives us what we expect. Sometimes it gives us what we need instead." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, drinking their tea and listening to the wind outside. Eventually, Arliss stood to leave, promising to check in the next day for news about Herbert Patterson. At the door, he paused. "You know, tomorrow's the winter solstice. Longest night of the year. But after that, the days start getting longer again, more light bit by bit." Thaddeus nodded, understanding the metaphor. "Bit by bit," he agreed. After Arliss had gone, Thaddeus returned to the sofa where Mosby still lay, now stretched out more comfortably. The cat watched as Thaddeus sat back down beside him, then, in a move so surprising that Thaddeus nearly gasped, crawled directly into his lap. For a moment, Thaddeus didn't know what to do. In the month since bringing Mosby home, the cat had gradually decreased the distance between them, had even begun to tolerate brief touches. But this deliberate seeking of closeness was entirely new. Carefully, as if handling something infinitely precious, Thaddeus placed a hand on Mosby's back. The purr resumed immediately, stronger than before, vibrating against his palm. "Well," Thaddeus said softly, "I guess this is new for both of us." Outside, the night deepened, the winter solstice approaching, that turning point when darkness begins, imperceptibly at first, to give way to light. Inside, man and cat sat together, in a silence that was no longer empty, but full of unspoken understanding. Later that night, after receiving a call from Mrs. Patterson that Herbert was stable and expected to recover, the doctors said if he'd been out there much longer. "Oh, Mr. Avner, I can't thank your cat enough." Thaddeus prepared for bed. As he passed the closed door of the master bedroom, he paused, hand on the knob. Then, with a deep breath, he opened it and entered, turning on the bedside lamp rather than the harsher overhead light. The room welcomed him, no longer a museum to grief, but simply a space waiting to be lived in again. He moved through his evening routine with a strange sense of rightness, as if returning to a path he'd strayed from too long. When he finally slipped beneath the covers, Mosby was already there, curled in the center of the bed. As Thaddeus settled, the cat stretched, then repositioned himself against Thaddeus's side, head resting lightly on his arm. "Thank you," Thaddeus whispered into the darkness. He wasn't sure if he was speaking to Mosby, to Doreen's memory, or to whatever force had brought this unlikely pair together. Perhaps to all three. Sleep came easily, deep and dreamless, as the year's longest night wrapped around the house like a protective cloak. Christmas Eve arrived with gentle snowfall, and temperatures mild enough that the icicles hanging from the eaves dripped steadily, creating a rhythmic background to the day's preparations. Thaddeus moved through the house with purpose, arranging cheese and crackers on Doreen's good serving platter, adjusting the small tree until the lights caught the silver ornaments he'd finally decided to hang, setting out the good napkins that had remained in their drawer for 3 years. Mosby supervised from various perches, seemingly interested in the unusual activity. Since the night of Herbert Patterson's rescue, The cat had undergone a transformation so profound that Thaddeus sometimes wondered if he was the same creature he'd brought home from Willow Haven. He still wasn't what anyone would call gregarious. He maintained his dignity and reserve, but the wall of fear and distrust had crumbled. Now he sought out Thaddeus's company, followed him from room to room, and had developed an endearing habit of sitting on whatever Thaddeus was trying to read, as if reminding him that attention should be paid to living beings, not just words on a page. Most remarkably, he had begun to play. Nothing elaborate. He showed no interest in the toy mice or jingle balls Thaddeus had purchased in hopeful anticipation, but he had developed a fondness for a length of ribbon that had fallen from a package. He would carry it in his mouth, drop it at Thaddeus's feet, and wait expectantly for it to be tossed or dragged across the floor. "You're turning into a proper cat," Thaddeus told him as he arranged a centerpiece of pine branches on the dining table. "Next thing I know, you'll be knocking things off shelves for amusement." Mosby, perched on a dining chair, simply blinked lazily in response. The doorbell rang at precisely 4 o'clock. Vianne had always been punctual to a fault, a trait Thaddeus appreciated more as he got older. "Merry Christmas, Uncle Thad," she greeted him, her arms full of colorfully wrapped packages. Behind her, snow swirled in the porch light, already coating the driveway he'd shoveled just hours before. Thaddeus accepted her kiss on his cheek and took the packages, setting them beneath the small tree. "Merry Christmas, Vianne. You're the first to arrive." "Of course I am. I wanted a few minutes with just you before everyone else gets here." She removed her coat, revealing a festive red sweater with tiny silver snowflakes embroidered around the collar. "Also, I'm dying to see how Mosby is doing. Arliss told me about the incredible rescue." "Is it true?" As if on cue, Mosby appeared in the living room doorway, regarding Vianne with what Thaddeus had come to recognize as cautious interest rather than fear. "It's all true," Thaddeus confirmed. "Herbert Patterson is home from the hospital already on strict rest orders. His daughter's staying with them through New Year's. Mrs. Patterson sent over a fruitcake yesterday with a note calling Mosby our Christmas angel." Vianne knelt, extending a hand toward the cat. "Hello, Mosby. I've heard you're a hero." To Thaddeus's surprise, Mosby approached her directly, sniffing her outstretched fingers before allowing her to gently stroke his head. "Well, I'll be," Thaddeus said softly. "He's never done that with anyone but me and Arliss." Vianne smiled up at him. "Maybe he knows I'm family." Her expression grew more serious. "You look good, Uncle Thad. Really good. Less haunted, if that makes sense." Before Thaddeus could respond, the doorbell rang again. This time it was Margaret Holloway, bearing a casserole dish that steamed in the cold air. "Scalloped potatoes," she announced. "Doreen's recipe, though I can never get them quite as creamy as she did. She always claimed there was no secret ingredient, but I never believed her." Thaddeus accepted the dish with a smile. The secret was an extra quarter cup of cream that she never put in the written recipe. She said it was to make sure no one's potatoes were ever as good as hers. Margaret's eyes widened. That sneak, after all these years of trying. They both laughed, and Thaddeus realized with a start that speaking of Doreen this way, lightly, fondly, with humor rather than crushing grief, felt right. It honored her more truly than his years of silent preservation ever had. Arliss arrived last, apologizing for the delay. "Had to help Mrs. Abernathy jumpstart her car. That old Buick of hers is on its last legs." He handed Thaddeus a bottle of wine. "Nothing fancy, but it should go well with dinner." Soon the four of them were settled in the living room, glasses of wine in hand, or sparkling cider for Margaret, who didn't drink, the conversation flowing more easily than Thaddeus had dared to hope. Mosby made appearances, never staying long but seeming comfortable with the unusual number of humans in his territory. "I still can't believe how he knew about Herbert," Margaret said, watching as Mosby delicately accepted a small piece of cheese from Vianne's fingers. "It's like something from those books about animals with special abilities." "The vet at the shelter told me cats are incredibly sensitive to changes in behavior and physiology," Thaddeus explained. "She thinks Mosby might have heard Herbert fall, or perhaps sensed his distress somehow. Whatever it was, I'm just grateful he was persistent enough to make us understand." "It's amazing to think what might have happened if you hadn't adopted him," Vianne said. "If you'd chosen a different cat that day." Thaddeus thought back to that afternoon at Willow Haven, how close he'd come to selecting one of the more obviously appealing cats. How Mosby, huddled in his corner, had seemed like the least likely choice. "I think," he said slowly, "that sometimes the things, or beings, that need the most healing are also the ones with the most to give. We just have to be patient enough to let them reveal themselves in their own time." A comfortable silence fell over the room, broken only by the soft crackling of the fire Arliss had built in the fireplace and the gentle notes of a Christmas carol playing from the radio in the kitchen. "Speaking of revelations," Margaret said finally, "Herbert and Martha have invited everyone on the street to a New Year's gathering. Nothing elaborate, they're calling it a gratitude gathering to celebrate his recovery. They specifically asked me to make sure you and Mosby would attend." She smiled. "I think Mosby may have to get used to being a local celebrity." "A New Year's party?" Thaddeus felt a flutter of anxiety at the thought of a larger social gathering, but it was milder than it would have been months ago. "I suppose we could make an appearance." "I'll be your +1, Arliss offered with a grin. Safety in numbers. As they moved to the dining table for dinner, Thaddeus found himself struck by how natural it felt to have these people in his home, around his table. The house that had been so silent for so long now hummed with conversation, laughter, the clink of cutlery against plates. Mosby stationed himself beneath Thaddeus's chair, occasionally accepting small morsels of chicken that found their way to the floor. His presence was a steady comfort, a reminder of how much had changed in just a few months. After dinner, as they gathered again in the living room with coffee and the pie from the diner, Arliss asked if he might play some carols on the piano. "Of course," Thaddeus said. Doreen would have insisted on it. As Arliss settled at the piano, his fingers moving expertly across the keys, Thaddeus felt a sudden wave of emotion, not the crushing grief that had been his companion for so long, but something more complex. Sadness, yes, for all that had been lost, but also gratitude for what remained and for what had been found. He excused himself quietly and stepped out onto the front porch, needing a moment to compose himself. The snow had stopped, and the night was clear and cold, stars pricking the black velvet sky with impossible brightness. He wasn't aware of Mosby following him until he felt a gentle pressure against his leg. Looking down, he found the cat sitting beside him, seemingly unbothered by the cold. "It's a lot, isn't it?" Thaddeus said softly. "All these changes." Mosby looked up at him, then out at the snow-covered yard, the street beyond with its houses outlined in Christmas lights, the vast, star-filled sky above. His whiskers twitched slightly, his posture alert but relaxed. "I didn't expect any of this, you know," Thaddeus continued. "When I went to the shelter that day, I thought maybe I'd find a cat to keep me company, something to focus on besides memories." He shook his head. "I never imagined—" He didn't finish the thought, wasn't sure he could put into words all that had transpired, not just Herbert Patterson's rescue, dramatic as that had been, but the quieter, deeper changes. The way the house had gradually transformed from a shrine to the past into a place where life happened again. The way he had begun to engage with the world, rather than merely observing it from behind glass. The way he had started, very slowly, to heal. The door opened behind them, spilling warm light onto the porch. Vianne stood there, concern evident in her expression. "Uncle Thad, is everything okay?" He turned to her with a smile that felt genuine. "Yes, everything is fine. Better than fine, actually. I just needed a moment." She stepped out to join them, wrapping her sweater tightly around herself against the cold. "It's a beautiful night." "It is," he agreed. They stood in companionable silence for a moment, watching their breath form clouds in the frigid air. From inside, the sounds of Arliss playing Silent Night drifted through the partially open door, the familiar melody both melancholy and uplifting. "I'm proud of you, Uncle Thad," Vianne said finally, her voice soft. "This hasn't been easy." "None of it." Thaddeus nodded, understanding all she wasn't saying, the grief, the isolation, the slow, painful process of finding a way forward. "It's still not easy," he admitted. "There are moments when I feel guilty almost, for changing things, for not keeping everything exactly as she left it." Vianne slipped her arm through his. "Aunt Doreen would hate that, you know. The idea of you preserving the house like some kind of museum. She was always changing things, rearranging furniture, trying new recipes, planting different flowers each year." Thaddeus smiled at the memory. She was never satisfied with leaving things as they were, always said there was room for improvement. Exactly. Vian squeezed his arm. She wouldn't want you frozen in place. She'd want you to keep growing, keep changing, keep living. Mosby, who had been sitting quietly beside them, suddenly stood and stretched, then headed for the door, looking back at them expectantly. I think our resident hero is ready to go back inside where it's warm, Thaddeus observed. Smart cat, Vian agreed with a laugh. Let's follow his lead. Back in the warmth of the living room, Arliss finished the carol and turned on the piano bench. Everything okay? He asked, his gaze moving between Thaddeus and Vian. Everything's fine, Thaddeus assured him. Just getting some fresh air. Margaret, who had been examining the photographs on the mantel, turned with a smile. I was just telling Arliss about the time Doreen decided the entire third grade should perform A Midsummer Night's Dream for the spring pageant. Do you remember that disaster, Thad? Thaddeus laughed, the sound coming easier than it once had. How could I forget? 38-year-olds trying to speak Shakespeare while wearing fairy wings made of coat hangers and pantyhose. The principal was furious, Margaret continued, her eyes twinkling with mischief. Said it was developmentally inappropriate, but Doreen wouldn't back down. And the performance? Arliss asked, clearly entertained. Terrible, Thaddeus and Margaret said in unison, then broke into laughter. Absolutely terrible, Margaret elaborated. Half the kids forgot their lines, the sets fell over, and Puck had a complete meltdown halfway through. But, Thaddeus added, those kids learned that they could try something difficult and survive the experience. That was always Doreen's point. The performance wasn't the goal. It was the courage to attempt it in the first place. A good life lesson, Arliss nodded. One I try to teach my students too. The conversation flowed from there. Stories of Doreen weaving naturally through discussions of current events, local gossip, and plans for the new year. Thaddeus found himself fully engaged, not just responding when addressed, but actively participating, even initiating topics. Mosby moved among them like a quiet sentinel, occasionally accepting gentle pats from the guests, but always returning to Thaddeus, as if checking on his well-being. At one point, the cat jumped onto the arm of Thaddeus's chair and settled there, a warm presence against his side. As the evening drew to a close, with Margaret saying she needed to get home before the roads became icy, and Vian gathering the dirty dishes despite Thaddeus's protests that they could wait until morning, Arliss moved to the piano one last time. One more song before we go, he suggested. Something special for Christmas Eve. Without waiting for a response, he began to play Have Yourself a Merry Little Christmas, not the upbeat version often heard in malls and on radio stations, but the original, more melancholy arrangement with its bittersweet lyrics about faithful friends and troubles being far away. The simple melody filled the room, wrapping around them like a warm blanket. Thaddeus felt his throat tighten with emotion, not just for what had been lost, but for what remained, and what might yet be found. When the last notes faded, there was a moment of perfect silence. Then Margaret spoke, her voice gentle with memory. Doreen loved that song, said it was honest about how holidays can be both happy and sad at the same time. She was right, Thaddeus said softly. As usual, after the guests had gone, with promises to gather again soon, Thaddeus moved through the house, turning off lights, straightening cushions, returning the space to order. But it was a different kind of order now. Not the sterile preservation of grief, but the comfortable disorder of a home that had been lived in, enjoyed. Mosby followed him on his rounds, occasionally darting ahead as if helping with the inspection. When they reached the master bedroom, the cat jumped onto the bed and settled in the center, watching as Thaddeus changed into pajamas and completed his nighttime routine. It was a good evening, wasn't it? Thaddeus said as he slipped beneath the covers. Different but good. Mosby made a soft sound that might have been agreement, then moved to curl against Thaddeus's side, his purr a gentle rumble in the quiet room. Thaddeus fell asleep with one hand resting lightly on the cat's back, his dreams peaceful for the first time in longer than he could remember. Christmas morning dawned clear and brilliant, sunlight sparkling off the fresh snow like millions of tiny diamonds. Thaddeus woke to find Mosby sitting on the windowsill, his attention fixed on something outside. "Merry Christmas," Thaddeus said, his voice rough with sleep. Mosby turned to look at him, then back to the window. Curious, Thaddeus rose and joined him, peering out at the winter landscape. In the garden he'd begun to reclaim over the past months, a cardinal had landed on the bare branch of the old apple tree. Its brilliant red plumage stood out vividly against the snow, a splash of life and color in the winter stillness. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Thaddeus murmured. As they watched, the cardinal was joined by its mate, the female's more subtle coloring a perfect complement to the male's brightness. The pair hopped along the branch together, occasionally touching beaks in what looked like affection. Doreen loved cardinals, Thaddeus told Mosby, said they reminded her that beauty can thrive even in the harshest conditions. The cat pressed a paw against the glass, as if trying to reach the birds. Not in predation, Thaddeus thought, but in greeting. After a moment the cardinals took flight, disappearing into the blue sky. But their brief presence had left something behind, a sense of continuity, of life's persistent renewal. Thaddeus dressed and made his way to the kitchen, where he prepared breakfast for himself and Mosby. As they ate, he found himself thinking of the day ahead. He'd promised to call Vianne later, and Alice had mentioned stopping by in the afternoon. Margaret had invited him for dinner with her family, an invitation he'd tentatively accepted, surprising both her and himself. And tomorrow, life would continue. There would be ordinary days and difficult ones, moments of joy and moments of remembering. The grief wouldn't disappear. He knew that now. It would always be part of him, just as Doreen would always be part of him. But it no longer defined him completely, no longer consumed all the space in his heart. There was room now for other things, for friendship, for music, for the simple pleasure of a cat's companionship, for whatever might come next. After breakfast, Thaddeus went to the closet, where he'd hidden the small package he'd prepared for Mosby, a new cushion for the windowsill, made from one of Doreen's old sweaters that still carried a faint trace of her perfume. He'd carefully sewn it himself, pricking his fingers numerous times in the process, but feeling that it was important somehow, this merging of past and present. He placed it on Mosby's favorite perch, and the cat approached it cautiously, sniffing with interest. After a thorough inspection, Mosby stepped onto the cushion, turned in a circle 3 times, and settled down with a contented sigh, his green eyes fixed on Thaddeus with what could only be described as approval. "Merry Christmas, Mosby," Thaddeus said softly. "Thank you for finding me." The cat blinked slowly. A gesture that Thaddeus had learned from Skylar at the shelter was the feline equivalent of a kiss, a sign of absolute trust. Outside, the sun continued to rise, casting long blue shadows across the snow. Inside, in a house that had once been frozen in grief, but was now gradually thawing, an old man and a once unwanted cat had found in each other something neither had expected, not just companionship, but redemption. Thaddeus Avner had gone to the shelter looking for the most beautiful cat, but had chosen instead the saddest one. In doing so, he had set in motion a chain of events that led not just to Herbert Patterson's rescue, but to his own salvation from the prison of grief he had built around himself. And Mosby, the cat no one had wanted, had found not just a home, but a purpose, proving that even the most damaged souls have value, have wisdom, have the capacity to heal not just themselves but others. As the Christmas morning light filled the room, Thaddeus felt something he hadn't expected to feel again: hope. Not the desperate hope of grief, the hope that somehow, someday, the pain might lessen, but a calmer, steadier hope, the hope of new beginnings, of connections rebuilt and strengthened, the hope of a life that honored what had been lost by continuing to move forward. "What do you think, Doreen?" he asked softly, not expecting an answer but feeling her presence in the room nonetheless, not as a ghost, but as a part of himself, the part that had loved and been loved for 40 years. The house creaked gently, settling in the morning sun. On the windowsill, Mosby stretched and yawned, then settled back on his new cushion, content in his place in the world. And somewhere deep inside, in a place that had been dark and silent for too long, Thaddeus felt something bloom, small and fragile, but unmistakable. The future, unexpected and unplanned, but filled with possibilities. "One step at a time," he told Mosby, who regarded him with those wise green eyes that had seen so much darkness, yet still recognized light when it appeared. "One step at a time." That was how healing happened, not in grand gestures or dramatic moments, but in small daily choices to move forward rather than remain still. In choosing the saddest cat instead of the most beautiful one, Thaddeus had inadvertently chosen life over memory, possibility over preservation. And in doing so, he had been saved, not just from the physical danger that Mosby's intervention with Herbert Patterson had averted, but from the slower, quieter death of a heart turned inward upon itself. As he settled into his armchair with a book, Mosby jumping down from the windowsill to join him, curling against his leg with trusting ease, Thaddeus thought about second chances, about how sometimes the light we're seeking is hidden in the places or beings the world has overlooked. Perhaps you too are searching for something that shines, something to illuminate the darker corners of your life. But what if the light you need isn't found in the obvious, the beautiful, the perfect? What if it's waiting in the broken, the forgotten, the overlooked? Sometimes it's precisely what the world has cast aside that finds us when we most need to be found. And in that finding, that connection between damaged souls, lies the possibility of healing, not just for one, but for both. For Thaddeus and Mosby, the journey had only begun. There would be challenges ahead, setbacks, moments of doubt, but they would face them together. Two unlikely companions who had found in each other exactly what they needed, exactly when they needed it most. And that, perhaps, is the greatest gift of all.